The wind screaming across the Siberian taiga did not howl. It fractured the air like shattering glass. At 73, Martha Higgins knew the sound of -45 degrees Celsius. She had lived in this isolated timber cabin on the edge of the Verkhoyansk Range for 20 years. Originally from Colorado, she and her late husband, Thomas, had come to Russia as wildlife biologists on a grant to study subarctic migratory patterns. When Thomas died of a sudden aneurysm 8 years ago, Martha chose to stay. The brutal, unforgiving wilderness was the only place she still felt connected to him. It was mid-January when the storm hit, a whiteout that erased the horizon and buried the towering pines in suffocating drifts. Martha was fighting her way back from the woodshed, hauling a sled of birch logs, when a strange shape caught her eye. It was a lump of dark charcoal against the blinding white, half buried near the base of a dead larch tree. Approaching cautiously, her breath pluming in thick white clouds, she dropped to her knees. It was a bird. Not just any bird, a golden eagle nestling, likely blown miles from its eyrie by the gale. It was scarcely larger than a football, covered in downy gray feathers that were currently matted with lethal, solid ice. Its eyes were shut tight, and its beak was clamped shut. There was no movement. Martha pulled off her heavy outer mitten, exposing her bare fingers to the biting cold, and pressed 2 fingers against the bird's breast. A heartbeat. It was so faint, so agonizingly slow. It felt like a watch ticking its final seconds. "Oh, you poor, broken thing," she whispered, scooping the rigid body into the thick folds of her parka. Inside the cabin, the cast-iron stove radiated a desperate heat, but Martha knew better than to place the freezing creature directly next to the fire. Rapid thawing would cause a fatal shock to its failing cardiovascular system. She laid the bird on a woolen blanket across the room and fumbled for her satellite phone. She dialed the emergency number for Dr. Robert Sterling, an avian specialist and old colleague back in Boston. The static was heavy, but Robert's voice broke through the crackle. "Martha, are you out of your mind? You can't rehabilitate a wild eagle in a blizzard at your age," Robert warned, his voice laced with genuine concern. "I'm not letting him die, Robert. Tell me what to do." Under Robert's guidance, Martha began the grueling process of slow resuscitation. She filled water bottles with lukewarm water, packing them around the eaglet's core, and used a syringe to place single drops of saline and glucose onto the bird's tongue. For 36 hours, she didn't sleep. She sat in the dim amber light of her kerosene lantern, massaging the bird's frozen wings, humming an old lullaby Thomas used to sing. On the morning of the 3rd day, the eagle opened its eyes. They were a piercing, defiant amber. Martha named him Apollo. Over the next 3 months, the cabin transformed into an avian nursery. Apollo's down was replaced by magnificent, dark brown plumage with the characteristic golden sheen on his nape. He grew with terrifying speed, his wingspan stretching across the small room, his talons becoming thick, curved daggers. The bond they formed was unprecedented. Wild eagles are notoriously solitary and aggressive, but Apollo would sit on the back of Martha's rocking chair, gently preening her gray hair with a beak capable of snapping bone. But a harsh reality was setting in. An eagle of Apollo's size required massive amounts of fresh meat, and Martha's winter stores were dangerously low. She had been feeding him the frozen venison and hare she had prepared for herself. By late April, the spring thaw had not yet arrived, and another freak blizzard, a late-season killer the locals called a white demon, descended upon the Verkhoyansk Range. For 8 days, the storm raged. The snow banked up over the cabin's windows, plunging them into perpetual darkness. The temperature dropped back to 30 below. Then, the generator failed. Martha, weakened by her restricted diet and the bone-chilling cold, developed a deep, rattling cough. Pneumonia set in with ruthless efficiency. Within days, she was bedridden, shivering violently under a mountain of blankets, her breathing shallow and labored. Apollo seemed to sense the shift. He paced the floorboards, his sharp talons clicking rhythmically against the wood, uttering low, distressed chirps. Martha knew she was dying, and she knew that if she died, Apollo would be trapped inside the cabin and starve. Mustering the very last of her strength, Martha rolled out of bed, her legs giving way immediately. She crawled across the rough wooden floorboards, dragging her body toward the heavy oak door. Every inch was an agony of breathless exhaustion. She reached the handle, pulled herself up slightly, and pushed the heavy timber ajar. The howling wind instantly threw it wide open, blasting freezing snow into the cabin. "Go," Martha croaked, pointing a trembling finger at the swirling white abyss. "Fly, Apollo. Go." The eagle stood at the threshold, the wind ruffling his majestic feathers. He looked out into the storm, then turned his head to look back at the frail woman on the floor. He let out a piercing screech, a sound of defiance that echoed over the roaring wind. Instead of taking flight, Apollo did the unthinkable. He turned his back on freedom, walked over to Martha, and spread his massive wings over her shivering body, using his own body heat to shield her from the freezing draft. He chose to stay. Martha lost consciousness. The rough, warm feathers of the apex predator the last thing she felt. When she awoke, the light in the room was blindingly bright. But it wasn't the whiteout of the storm. It was the sterile fluorescence of a medical clinic. A face hovered over her, Silas Fletcher, a rugged Alaskan bush pilot who delivered her supplies every quarter. "Welcome back to the land of the living, Martha," Silas said, a relieved smile breaking across his weathered face. "Apollo," she rasped, her throat feeling like sandpaper. Silas let out a disbelieving laugh, shaking his head. "That bird of yours. You've been out for 4 days, Martha. When the storm finally broke, I flew out to check on you because you missed your radio check-in. Found the cabin door blown wide open." Silas pulled up a chair, leaning in. "Martha, I found you on the floor, barely breathing. But you weren't alone. That massive eagle was perched on the edge of the bed. And next to your head, on the floor," Silas paused, his eyes wide with leftover shock, "there were 3 fresh snowshoe hares and a ptarmigan. He hadn't eaten a single bite of them." Martha's eyes welled with tears as Silas continued. "When you told him to go, he didn't flee. He used the open door to hunt. He flew into the tail end of a blizzard to bring you food. Martha, when I tried to load you onto the stretcher, he nearly took my eye out. I had to throw a tarp over him just to get you to the plane." "Where is he?" she pleaded, trying to sit up. "Doctor, Sterling told me to let him go once you were safe," Silas said gently. "We brought him outside the clinic in Yakutsk. I pulled the tarp off, and he took to the sky. He circled the hospital 3 times, screamed once, and headed toward the mountains." It took Martha 2 months to fully recover from the pneumonia. Her children, back in the States, begged her to sell the cabin and move home, but the taiga was in her blood. Against everyone's advice, Silas flew her back to her isolated home as the brief Siberian summer bloomed. The cabin was exactly as she had left it, though Silas had repaired the door and restocked the pantry. Martha stepped out onto the porch, breathing in the scent of pine needles and thawing earth. The sky was a brilliant, endless blue. She lived quietly for the next 3 years. She never saw another golden eagle, though she often looked to the sky, a lingering ache in her chest for the magnificent creature that had saved her life. Then came a crisp October morning. Martha was on the porch, wrapped in Thomas's old wool coat, sipping her morning coffee. A massive shadow suddenly swept across the clearing, blocking out the sun. Martha froze. Descending from the clouds with breathtaking grace was a golden eagle, larger than any she had ever documented in her career. The sheer size of the creature was terrifying, its wingspan eclipsing the sunlight as it banked sharply and landed heavily on the sturdy wooden fence post 20 yards away. It was a wild, lethal apex predator. Its talons gripped the wood with terrifying power, and its amber eyes locked onto her. Martha stood up slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs. She placed her coffee mug down. She didn't dare approach. The presence of the wild beast demanded profound respect. The eagle stared at her for a long, silent minute. The wind rustled the pine needles. Then, with a deliberate, calculated movement, the eagle opened its beak and dropped something onto the grass at the base of the fence post. It let out a low, familiar chirp, a sound that transported Martha instantly back to the freezing nights by the kerosene lantern. With a powerful thrust of its legs, the eagle launched itself back into the air, its massive wings beating the wind as it spiraled upward, catching a thermal until it was nothing but a speck against the clouds. Tears streaming down her weathered cheeks, Martha walked slowly out to the fence post. Lying in the frost-covered grass was a single, freshly caught snowshoe hare. Apollo had come back, not to be a pet, and not to be tamed, but to pay a visit to the one creature in the unforgiving wilderness he considered his equal. He had remembered the life debt, and across the vast, brutal expanse of Siberia, he had returned to tell her she was not alone.